I just want to say, as I normally like to comment on the hymns, and boy, don't you love it as well as my soul?
Amen.
I love that second last verse. My sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole. Now that's important, right? That Jesus paid everything. That He paid all of our sin debt. Because I'm just going to tell you that we've gone over the fact that neither me nor you can earn enough to pay our sin debt. But y'all, we could not pay part of it. Right? There's just a little bit left. I'm still going to come up with a liquid. I need it all taken care of. But not in part, but the whole was nailed to the cross. And I bear it no more. Praise the Lord. Hey, it is well with my soul. I know you might have had a rough week this past week. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you're looking forward to a rough week. I know that sounds weird, but you know it's coming. It's one of those things. Monday's right around the corner, and you're thinking, oh, everything that might be in store. But if there's anything you can rejoice and be excited about today, it can be that Jesus is Lord and He's your Lord. That your sin, not in part, but the whole was paid, and it's been nailed to the cross, so that when everything's maybe bad, I know that right now the greatest truth we can have is what happens if we die today. If we die today, if I die today, I know that I'm going to heaven. Why? Because Jesus Christ. Amen. And we can know the exact same thing. That's what we're here for. We're here to celebrate that truth, and we're going to be in 1 Samuel 11. 1 Samuel chapter 11. And what we're looking at today is the model start. You see the title there in your bulletin, a model start. Now this is going to be following the story of Saul. We're going to look through the whole chapter here in 1 Samuel 11. It's a shorter chapter. And I made the point when we started 1 Samuel. So I know I'm making you fake all your memory all the way back. But when it started, I made the point when we come to the Old Testament. Here's one thing I know that's true. It's not just a book of illustrations. See, sometimes that's how people treat the Old Testament. They treat it as if, well, Jesus wasn't there then, so all we really need is the New Testament, and we just tell stories from the Old Testament to help illustrate it. No, that's not true. In fact, Jesus comes into the New Testament, and He tells us that everything written in the Old Testament was about Him. Right? And so we know that Jesus is here even in the Old Testament, even though He hasn't been born yet. And it's going to be telling us about this one, that God's grace is all throughout the Old Testament. Sometimes we think about the Old Testament law, we think about grace, and we think, well, those two things were separate, and to the point where the grace didn't come to the New Testament. Well, if you think that, boy, you won't understand the Old Testament. Why? Because God shows grace all throughout the Old Testament. It's one of the awesome facts in the Old Testament that even when they fail at breaking the law, God still shows them grace. And so one of the things I also pointed out is that sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we find characters to emulate. Right? So one of the famous ones that is actually in this book of 1 Samuel is David taking on Goliath. Right? And sometimes you hear a message on that, and the answer will be, you need to be more like David. Well, I really don't want to cheat on my wife. Right? So I really don't want to be David. Right? Because that's what him and Bathsheba, that's a pretty big part. We just want to zoom out one thing and look at David and Goliath. No, the reality is that when we read through the entire Old Testament, when we see these things, we need to realize that it isn't necessarily the man in the story that's the hero, but it's always God that's the hero. God's the hero in David and Goliath. Right? David can't kill Goliath with a stone unless God behind it. Right? It doesn't happen. And the same thing when we see here today, we're going to be looking at Saul. And y'all, I've told you, there's not that much to look up to in Saul to begin with. It sort of looks like it. Today we'll see some really good things. It takes a pretty harsh turn with Saul, and he's not somebody that you really want to emulate. But here in this chapter, he does some things here in 1 Samuel 11. But boy, this will be something we want to follow. This will be something we do want to do. But even in it, it's still founded upon the work of God rather than the sufficiency of men. Now, why am I making such a big point about that? I'm making such a big point about that, and we'll get to this in the message a little bit. It's because the last thing I want is for us to come to church and get encouraged and falsely inspired by the idea that when we leave here, you're now strong enough to do what you got to do. You're not. God is. He's the one that's strong enough. And so I want us to come to be encouraged and leave here trusting Him, not trusting us. Right? And so I don't want you to look at Saul and be like, I just got to be more like Saul. And I want you to really look through Saul and see Jesus and think, I've got to trust Him. He's got to be my strength. And so that's why I make that big part here in the beginning as we get into this. It's 1 Samuel 11. We will be looking at Saul. So follow along as we read, beginning in verse 1 here in 1 Samuel 11. Then Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "On this condition will I make a treaty with you, that I gouge out all your right eyes, and thus bring disgrace on all of Israel." And the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days' respite, that we may send messengers throughout all the territory of Israel. Then if there's no one to save us, we'll give ourselves up to you." When the messengers came to give it to Saul, they reported the matter in the ears of the people, and all the people wept aloud. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and Saul said, "What's wrong with the people that they're weeping?" So they told him the news of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. He took a yoke of oxen, and he cut them in pieces, and he sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." And then the dread of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out as one man. And when he mustered them at Bezek, the people of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they said to the messengers who had come, "Thus shall you say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, Tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you shall have salvation." And when the messengers came and told the men of Jabesh, they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." And the next day Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning, and walked in the morning watch, and they struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day, and those who survived were scattered, so that not 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring the men, that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingdom." And so all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Let's pray. Father, as we come to this time, Lord, and we read your word, I pray that you would speak in and through it, and use it, Lord, as only you can. It's in Jesus' name we pray. The first thing we see here is a test. A test, right? So let me recall to you, as always, you got to remember what happens before. Well, in the last chapter, Saul was actually anointed and pronounced as king. If you remember, we talked about how Saul was told, he ran into Samuel. Samuel told him that you're going to be the next prince, the next king. And then he brought him in front of everybody, and Saul was hiding the baggage, but he called Saul out of the baggage, and he anointed him right there in front of everybody, and everybody praised and said, "Long live the king." And we didn't read this section, but at the very last piece of that chapter, it made it clear that there were some who did not want Saul as king, but it said Saul held his tongue. Right? So there's this point where he held his tongue. But this is something completely new for Israel. So that's why it's kind of important to understand that, because it makes a little more sense when we read 1 Samuel 11. They've never had a king, and since it's brand new, number one, they probably don't have a castle or anything like that. There's no palace that he's going to live in. We know that because he's out working in the fields still. He's not even living as a king. It isn't like he's surrounded by servants or anything yet. And not only that, I kind of picture that as U.S. politics a little bit too. We're not getting political, but whether it was Obama or Trump, there will always be people who say things such as, "Well, that's not my president," when it most certainly is. That's who's in office. Right? But when we say that, what they mean is they don't simply support a declaration. It's kind of the idea that respect isn't given, it's earned, right? And so they say things, "Well, that's not my president," until they show it. Well, imagine that if you're Saul, and you're the first ever king that's just been announced by Samuel. You think everybody's on board? No. Right? There's still people kind of skeptical about this. How's this thing going to work out? I don't really like Saul. I didn't elect him, right? And they're over here in their area, and their area. And so Saul's dealing with all this. And he's been called king, but just because you're called something, is he going to deliver? Well, he gets the chance here in 1 Samuel 11. Here in these first 4 verses, we hear about a chance for Saul to prove himself. Now it says the Ammonite went up to Jabesh Gilead. This was part of Israel's nation, and so it was one of their tribes, and these people they needed to go and save. And this Ammonite comes and he surrounds them, and they ask to make a treaty with him. Right? So this once again shows the kingdom's kind of divided. You got this one area wanting to set a treaty up with the Ammonites, and the Ammonite gives them a pretty harsh condition. Right? I'll make a treaty with you if you let me gouge out all your right eyes. Ouch. Right? And that would do two big things, right? Number one, if you've only got one eye, you can still push a plow and work the field. And so they still have their slave labor that they can pay taxes and everything to the Ammonite. But if you don't have this eye, you're probably not going to be very effective in battle. So what was this essentially doing? It was cutting the hands off of these people, basically making them slaves and making it where they could never rise up again and fight against the Ammonites. It was crippling them. But then on top of that, the second thing is it was a shameful thing. It was heaping on shame. It was almost this way of just kicking them while they're down and completely demoralizing them, so that shame would be heaped upon them. And so that's a pretty harsh condition, and obviously the men of Jabesh Gilead didn't want to do it. And so what do they say? They say, give us a week, and if nobody will come save us, we'll turn ourselves over to you. Now, don't ask me why the Ammonites let them have a week. Probably pride, I would assume. And when I think about this, the other thing made me think of U.S. politics. This makes me think of like every action movie ever. At the very end, when the villain has got the guy at gunpoint, but he goes on like a 30-minute speech, and eventually he gets killed because of it. Right? That's how it happens. The bad guy won't hush. Well, that's what's happening here. The Ammonites say, "Yeah, sure." They're probably prideful. They probably think that they won't have anybody to come save them. But even if they do, we can beat them too. Right? And so the pride here says, "Sure, let them have a week." Right? Which is crazy, I know, but he does. And so they take a week and they send word to all of Israel, and it finally comes to Saul while he's out in the field pushing oxen. Now, this once again shows that the kingdom wasn't very centralized, because it didn't go to him immediately. It didn't even really go to him. It went to all the people, and he had to ask why everybody's crying. Well, regardless, the king hears the news, and so he's faced with a test. How's he going to handle it? I had a love-hate relationship, well, like most students, with testing in school. Testing fun, right? I remember in like elementary school, they give you peppermints because apparently that's supposed to perk you up before a test. And then they would tell you to get enough sleep, and they'd say you got to eat breakfast, right? So they'd actually have a good breakfast on testing days, and not like regular school breakfast, which I enjoyed, right? Everybody always complained about school lunch, and I'm over here chowing down, right? Give me whatever you got. But it was good. But anyway, they give you the special stuff, and then, especially in elementary school, I know we went all mechanical, well, now they're probably digital, but get your brand new number 2 pen. So it had to be a number 2. I don't know what that even means. I assume it has to do with the thickness of the lead. I know that's probably a simple thing, but I was always wondering when I was in elementary school, why can't I have number 1? I never been seen a number 1 pencil. But regardless, got to get your number 2 pencil, got to get a couple of them to sharpen it in the thing, and you're getting ready for your test, and you sit down, and it is a bottle of nerves, isn't it? Because even though you might have studied or you think you know what the scary thing is when you open it up, being faced with that thing thinking, I don't know what that is at all. Right? That's the nervous part. But that being said, before I offend somebody, because I know I'm fond of that, I will say I know there's such a thing as test anxiety and people who probably really do struggle with that. But I also think that that's probably more of an exception than the rule. And that goes to this next point. I had this classmate in school, and they were kind of competitive with me. Secretly, I was competitive too. But if you lose and they don't know you're playing, you don't lose, right? And so that's what I would do. So secretly, I was competitive too, but I wouldn't act like it. But they were competitive. And so when it came to test time, they're like, we'll do better than him. So we'd always test, and I always did pretty well at testing. And so I'd do better. And that person would come up and they'd say, what'd you get? I'd tell them, and they'd tell me what they got. And then they'd say, I just don't test well. And I would think, so you don't do that thing that proves that you actually know what you learned well. Right? You can't do that part where you actually have to answer it. Right? No. Right? Well, that's what I'm saying. I know some people really have test anxiety, but this was one where they just didn't know it. Right? And they were afraid to say it, and they said, well, I couldn't do the test well. Well, the reality is, even though none of us like tests, you still have them today. You definitely have them in your faith. And whether you like it or not, you're going to have to face it. See, Saul was the king, and he comes to this point where he's faced with, all right, do I get to be a coward and just cry like everybody else and let Jabesh Gilead do their own thing and never have the respect of the people? Or do I stand up as the king, rally the people together, and do what I'm supposed to do, whether or not we win or not? He's going to stand up. And so he's faced with the test. when I was growing up in church, I remember, and I'll go ahead and tell you up front, a lot of the message today is very simple, but it was something I learned from a pastor that I've never let go of. And it's that a test ultimately leads to our testimony, right? And so the first thing he would always tell us, he'd say, on a Sunday morning, one of the worst things, number one, don't ever treat church like you're just checking off a box. I mean, I want you to be here, and if that means you're checking off a box to be here, don't quit, because I want to see your face. But realize that it's more than that. It's so much more than that. It's brothers and sisters gathered together, worshiping a true and living God, right? We don't serve a God that's dead. We don't serve a God that just shows up as a fairy tale in a book. We serve a God who walked on earth, lived a perfect life, died, raised from the dead, is still alive, and is alive today. So when we pray, we're not just reciting stuff randomly. We're actually praying to a God that's alive, that hears us, that can make a difference, that can change things. We're praying to a God that we can put our trust in, our faith in, our rest in, that gives us peace. This is a real God, right? When we come together and worship as brothers and sisters, that God, that's special. It is well with my soul. Is it? Yes, well with my soul. Why? Because my soul is with the confines He's guided. God. He's not letting me go. So, you know the backstory behind that. The man that wrote the song lost his entire family in a shipwreck. So I can say he would definitely hasten the day when faith shall be sight. That means he would see his loved ones again. But even so, it was well with his soul. I'm not going back to the hymn. But the reality is, we come on a Sunday, and that's what we get to take part in. But he would always say, on a Sunday, you're going to hear truth. You're going to hear a truth of some sort. Through God's Word, He's going to give you something. He's going to speak to you. And then He'd say, you better pay attention, because next week, you're going to be tested on it. And man, don't you remember like when your mom and daddy used to tell you something and you didn't listen to them, and then you hated to prove that they were right afterwards? Right? Well, that's how I would treat my pastor too, because I would grow up and he'd say that, and I'm like, no, I won't. And then like Monday morning hits me with something that I needed that I heard from Sunday, and I'm thinking, that jerk knew what he was talking about, right? I love him, right? I love him, pastor. And so, anyways, that was the thing. We were getting tested on it. Well, the same is true for us. Right? When God teaches you something, He says that you should count yourself joyful and blessed to go through various trials. Well, it doesn't sound like fun at all. But why? Because through testing, it produces patience or steadfastness. And that'll have its perfect work. God sends us tests in order to challenge us in what we learn, to challenge our trust in Him. Right? Wouldn't it be easy just to walk around? It's real easy for people to say they're Christians, right? So if you ask, well, the numbers sadly declining, but if you ask most people in America right now whether or not they're a Christian or believe in God, you probably still have a slight majority towards yeah. But then we look around and we think, that probably isn't true. Right? Because it's one thing to say you're a Christian. It's a whole other thing that when you face a test, you show yourself. That's what testing does for us. And when we're faced with this issue, we're either going to respond with faith or failure. We're either going to trust God or we're going to trust something else. And so we either have victory or failure. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, are you ready for the test? But then the second thing takes place. We have a Spirit-powered victory. A Spirit-powered victory. So Saul hears the news, and the test comes, and how he responds is going to show what kind of king he's going to be and how he's going to have the respect of the people. But something awesome happens for Saul, right? So it says he asks the people, why are you crying? And they say, well, this is what's happening in Jabesh Gilead. And it says that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. The Spirit of God rushed upon him. He was angered. His anger was greatly kindled when he heard about it. And so he gets this awesome Spirit of the Lord. Now, when we see that language in the Old Testament, it's a little different than the New Testament. Right? The Spirit of God doesn't dwell in them like it dwells in us now in the New Covenant. But it was all throughout the Old Testament. In fact, when you see this, it sounds a whole lot like what happens in the book of Judges. Go read the book of Judges, especially Samson. You remember Samson, the guy with the long hair and super strong, right, that eventually falls prey to the seduction of a woman. Right? Well, in that story of Samson, though, he does some pretty awesome things, like ripping out the jawbone of a donkey and killing people with it. And he's just a monster, right? I haven't watched the movie. I'm assuming it isn't that good. But regardless, the story of Samson is very good. But every time Samson has all these bouts of strength, this ain't like Hercules, right? This ain't like he got a little bit of God juice or something. No, it says, every time you read it, the Spirit of God rushed upon him, or the hand of God was upon him, and then Samson went and did these things. Well, the same is true here for Saul. The Spirit of God comes upon him. And then what does he do? He does some awesome things. First, he kills his expensive oxen. These would have been very prized possessions because they're going to be used in all the work. But on top of that, it also probably signified the end of the kingship. I mean, the beginning of the kingship finally. Why? Because he was kind of saying here, from this point forward, Saul's not coming back to the fields. Right? It's going to be king from this point forward because we're going to be running an army. So we see something symbolic going on here. But he also sends off these pieces of oxen everywhere. And he says, if you don't come out after Saul and Samuel, the same will happen to your oxen. So that's obviously a princely threat. It was a threat, but it was a needed threat. And it seems harsh, but it rallies support. And they give word to Jabesh. So it says all these people gathered together. And he sends word to Jabesh and tells them, we're going to come save you. And I love what Jabesh Gilead does after this. It doesn't tell us this, but the dialogue changes there. And I'll point it out for you. Verse 10, therefore the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. That's them talking to the Ammonites. Okay. So what had happened was, they were told that before the sun is hot, we're going to come save you. This is Jabesh Gilead says, okay guys, yeah, we're surrendering tomorrow. Knowing that if Saul lives up to his word, they're not going to reach that point. And they didn't. Saul gets to that time, he splits his army up into 3 companies, and it says they struck down the Ammonites. And the picture it paints is a complete and utter victory. Right? They scattered them everywhere. It says that not 2 were left together. They ran the Ammonites off. They won greatly. Saul utterly destroys them, but never forget the key, the Spirit of God that rushed upon them. The Spirit of God that rushed upon them. I already told you about my competitiveness and testing, so let's just keep that trend going. I also play high school basketball, and I'm going to tell you, sometimes, not all the time, I run through Sunday's message with Nicole on Saturday night, and so if she ever seems like she's rolling her eyes, it's because she's already heard this before. But no, it's also because I'm bouncing stuff off of her. And I told her this, and she looked at me like I was a dummy. So if you look at me like I'm a dummy, I'll hold it against you just like I'm holding it against her. Anyway, I was playing basketball, and I know, y'all, that this isn't the way God necessarily works, right? And what I mean by this is this. I was playing basketball, and I was a center, and what that means is I had to shoot a lot of free throws, right? Because people were always fouling me and stuff like that. So I had to shoot a lot of free throws. And you want to talk about nerves and testing. I always had nerves in a free throw line. Because that's one point where everybody's watching you, nobody's watching anybody else, and they're all watching you, and you got to sit and shoot a ball that should be semi-easy, but not that easy, at least not to me, right? And so I remember I would practice them all the time, because we had to in practice, but I practiced a little bit more because I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to do this a lot more. But during this same period in my life, I was still a babe in Christ. I'd been saved not too long, and I was going to church, and I was learning and growing. And so in the midst of it, God was teaching me something. And this is where the semi-silly part gets in, and you could say, I don't believe you, but you don't have to, I believe it. And this is what we'd do. I'd get to the free throw line, and I'd have this, anybody deal with social anxiety? Got some people here that you wouldn't admit it, but in the inside, you're just a mess, especially when you're around people. Right. So I'm doing that. I was watching Alex play baseball not too long ago. They were pitching, and I told Nicole, I said, I was never that good at baseball. I decided that before the guy even pitched the ball, I was either going to swing or not swing because I had a 50-50 chance of being right? And so I wasn't going to have to worry about thinking about it. That was what's going on. So the same thing in my head at the free throw line. All right, here we go. What am I supposed to learn? I'm supposed to hold it this way, I'm supposed to sit this way. And I would try my hardest, and I'd always miss. But sometimes I would sit there, and I'd say, no, you know what I need to do? I need to pray. And so nobody else knew I was doing it, but I'd have one of those silent prayers, and I'm like, Lord, I ain't going to make this free throw unless you help me. And I'd make it. Now, I know that's silly. Right? I know that God, it ain't like I know the foolproof way. You want to be a better athlete, right? Just pray to God, because I'm pretty much proof that that's not true, right? But what I am telling you is that God was teaching teenage Dalton something through something as simple as a free throw. So whether or not you might say, "I was just a coincidence," not to me. God was teaching me something. He was saying, stop trusting yourself, even in something like this. Do you think because you practice so much that you can even do this on your own? But no matter how hard you work, you're never going to be able to live a perfect life. You've got to trust me. You've got to trust me if you actually want to make it. And so that's what he taught me through that. See, when we come to this point here in Saul, he hit the test, but the key here was the Spirit of God. And so this is going to be either humbling or encouraging to some of you. Humbling in the sense that if you think that you can do it on your own, kind of what I talked about in the beginning, if you leave here feeling completely self-sufficient, that I got this Christian thing on lock and I can handle it, you will fall flat on your face. And then you may even be surprised. But don't be surprised, because that's what's supposed to happen. I kind of picture this guy just saying, "Here, go do what you want to do and see what happens." And boy, we fell over and over and over and over again. We need to realize the victory that we really need when it comes to these tests isn't, boy, I could just muster up enough faith. Because even then you think you're working for something. Am I trying hard enough? No. Trust Him. We trust that He's actually the strength in it. And then for the encouraging thing is, some of you probably think, "Well, I really can't do this. I'm too weak. Well, I keep trying to live this Christian life the way I'm supposed to, and I'm just too weak." Well, hey, that's actually a good place to be, because you ain't far from wrong. The Bible says, when we embrace weakness, His strength is made perfect in us. So Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, "So I will therefore boast in my weakness, that His strength will be perfect." Boast in the fact that I can't do it. Why? Because God can. Once again, it's one of those very misquoted verses, right? When people say, "Well, God will never give you anything more than you can handle." Knowing that there's that verse that says, in everything, He gives you a way of escape, right? But the key is, God will give you more than you can handle. He'll never give you more than He can handle, as long as you trust Him. And yet the test comes, and what we need is a Spirit-powered victory. If we're going to pass the test, it's going to be because God does it, not because y'all, me, all of us, we suddenly became good enough to do it on our own. That's not how it works. But then finally, testimony. I alluded to this already, but this is where it comes together. Testimony. At the last verses, 12 through 15, the victory, Saul continues to be a model example. This is one of the last times we actually see something worthy of emulating in Saul, but it certainly is. When Israel wins, Saul has gotten the people's support, and the problem is they're almost too zealous. So this calls us back to the last chapter. I told you there were people who didn't really support Saul as king, but Saul held his tongue. Well, now, all the people that are on his side saying, "Let's go find those boys that doubted you, and we'll kill them right now. Right? We're going to prove them wrong. You did it, Saul." And so all of them are ready to do it, and Saul finally stands up. He says, "No. No." A prideful king would have agreed and let the cult and the mob do their work, but here a good leader protects his people and even those that don't necessarily like him. He says, "No man's going to die here today." And then he does something even better. He saves them, and then he says, "We need to remember that the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." He stops the mob, claiming that enough blood has been shed, and then he gives glory of the victory to the one who really earned it, God. He shares the testimony that God was the one that was the strength. And Saul is then, the kingdom was renewed, and Saul was lifted up and supported. Don't you love a good testimony? People stand up and share testimony. I've heard a lot of really good ones through, North Greenwood and Southeastern chapel services. You hear some testimonies. Especially church services, been in a number of those, heard some awesome testimonies. Youth camps, had a lot of chances to hear some pretty awesome testimonies. But one thing that I judge every testimony by, well, I'll tell you about it, is this. Some testimonies, and y'all know what I'm talking about, some testimonies can be very heart-wrenching and moving. They almost, people share your story and you're up there wanting to break down in tears just listening to it, and you can't imagine it. But they share all of this, and then Jesus or God gets like a line in the end. Well, as emotional as that was, not a good testimony. Because, what is a testimony? A testimony isn't for me to tell you, boy, let me tell you about how rough my life has been. A testimony isn't, well, let me tell you how good I'm doing now. The testimony is, let me tell you how good God is. An awesome testimony is when we get to all that stuff and then you say, but God. At some point in the testimony, but God came in and He completely routed it. And so when I get to the end and I'm praising God, I'm not saying, boy, I really did awesome through it. You can imagine how awesome I was through it. Wrong! I would say, you can't imagine how awesome God was through it. He was the awesome one. And I had to completely rest and trust in Him. And that's what Saul did here. He gets to the end of the victory. And this is why I said, boy, this ain't like the Saul we're going to see a little bit later. This is a model Saul. And this model Saul, who's this new king, should have taken all that glory and held on to it and been like, guys, y'all remember when I whooped them Ammonites for you? Well, I did something good, didn't I? I was strong. I'm the best king y'all guys could have ever wished for. You are going to be looking forward to some great years with me as king, but he doesn't do that. He says, we need to remember that the Lord gave us salvation, that He's the one that's worthy of the testimony, that He's the one that's worthy of the glory. And you know, how foolish is it when we actually think we can steal something for ourselves? We can't. We can't. Everybody in here, especially if you trust in Christ as your Savior, every one of you that's a born-again believer has a testimony. You have the testimony of your salvation, and that's an awesome one. No matter what it's like. I hate when people coming out, I didn't really have that eventful of a childhood or a teenage. I've always been in church, so my testimony is not that exciting. Were you dead, and did you become alive? All right, pretty exciting. Right? You don't have to have the terrible testimony that ends into a miraculous salvation for your testimony to be good. All of them are awesome. A salvation testimony, but you probably have more testimonies than that. This was one of those opportunities where Saul should have raised up an Ebenezer. He should have put a rock there to remember it, because instead he's going to move on from this and he's going to forget the fact that God was his strength when he should have remembered it. It was something for him to look back on. We have testimonies in our lives. Each and every time God's tested you, pass, you have a testimony. If you trusted Him, you come through it at the other end and you say, God was good through that. I was battling cancer and I was worried, but I was healed. God was good. I had that loved one. I reached an older age and finally passed on, and it was hard, but I trusted God. He was good. I lost my job. Didn't know what I was going to do. I tried to find something through classifieds and all these other things. But then I trusted Him and knew that He had good plan for me, and I did what I knew I was supposed to do, and He opened up doors for me in a way I could never imagine. And what am I going to say after this? I'm going to say, boy, I worked hard to get to this. No, I'm going to say, God is good. We are going to be tested. And if you're ready for the test, when you get to it, don't think you're strong enough. Trust in God, who you already know is strong enough. He can give you a spirit-powered victory. And when you come out of it, give Him the glory. Our lives should be constantly focused at pointing other people at how great He is. And to take the glory would be lying and stealing. So be ready for the test. Trust the strength of the Spirit, and be ready to tell others about how good God was